At dawn on the 19th of February, 1487, the city of Tenochtitlan was not yet awake. Most of its 200,000 inhabitants still lay in their reed mats, the last heat of the hearth fires fading. But on the island's central plaza, everything was already in motion. The great temple, the Templo Mayor, had been under construction for 4 years. Now its twin pyramids stood finished, one dedicated to Tlaloc, the rain god, the other to Huitzilopochtli, the war god and patron of the Aztecs. The new sanctuaries at the top had been carved, painted, and gilded. Staircases of black volcanic stone climbed steeply to the sky, and at the base of those staircases, prisoners waited. The ceremony was not a private affair. Delegations from every major city in the empire had arrived. Tlaxcala, Texcoco, Tlacopan, Calula, and dozens of other tributary states sent their lords. The captive kings of 3 conquered provinces were already in the city, their hands bound, their faces painted. They had been brought here to witness their own defeat made permanent. The Aztec Emperor Ahuitzotl, who had ordered the expansion of the temple, stood on a platform overlooking the plaza. He wore the turquoise diadem of imperial authority. Behind him, the crack of a wooden drum began. By 6 in the morning, the priests had taken their positions. 4 of them stood at the top of Huitzilopochtli's pyramid, each holding an obsidian knife. The first victim was led up the 114 steps. He was a noble from a conquered province, a man who had once ruled his own city. The priests laid him across the sacrificial stone. The knife moved in a single practiced arc. The heart was extracted, still beating, and raised to the sun. The body was kicked down the steps to the waiting priests below, who would flay and dismember it. The head was placed on the skull rack. By 7 in the morning, 50 hearts had been offered. The flow of victims did not slow. The Emperor Ahuitzotl himself participated in the sacrifice. Chroniclers later reported that he cut out the hearts of several captives with his own hands. The blood ran down the temple steps in streams so thick that they could be seen from the edge of the lake. The smell of fresh blood mixed with copal incense hung over the plaza. The priests worked in relays because the work was physically exhausting. A single priest might perform 10 or 12 sacrifices before he had to rest. Others took his place. There was no pause. By noon, the sun stood directly overhead. The drumming had not stopped. The plaza was slick with blood. Priests waded through it. The ritual would continue for 4 days. The exact number of victims is not known. The most careful modern estimates put the figure at between 10,000 and 80,000 people. The Aztec chroniclers wrote that 20,000 were killed on the first day alone. The Spanish accounts, written decades later, vary wildly. What is certain is that the sacrifice was not a single mass execution. It was a process, organized and relentless. Each victim was processed individually. Each heart was offered to a specific god. Each body was butchered, and the meat distributed to noble families, who ate it as a form of religious communion. On the second day, the city's canals ran red. The drainage system, designed to carry rainwater back to Lake Texcoco, was not designed for this volume of blood. The water turned dark. The causeways became difficult to cross because of the bodies being transported to the edge of the lake, where they would be burned or fed to animals. The priests began to show signs of exhaustion. Some collapsed. Others were replaced by younger initiates. But the ritual could not be stopped. To stop would be to admit that the gods had not been properly fed. And if the gods were not fed, the sun would not rise. The Emperor Ahuitzotl had planned this ceremony for years. His predecessor, Tizoc, had failed to conduct a sufficiently grand dedication, and the empire had been displeased with the gods. Ahuitzotl was determined to correct that. He had spent the previous year campaign across the valley, from the Gulf Coast to the Pacific, capturing prisoners for this specific purpose. Entire towns had been emptied of their male populations. The prisoners were marched to Tenochtitlan in chains, hundreds of miles. Many did not survive the journey. Those who did were kept in wooden cages near the temple, waiting their turn. By the end of the second day, the cages were still full. The priests had not even reached the first tier of captives. On the third day, the ritual shifted. The sacrifice of common prisoners gave way to the sacrifice of nobles and kings. The rulers of Koyokan, Kuenehuac, and Xochimilco were led up the steps. They had been given a special honor. Their hearts would be offered to Huitzilopochtli himself. They did not resist. Some chanted their own death songs. One of them, the Lord of Matlatzinco, reportedly smiled as he laid down on the stone. He had been captured in battle 3 years earlier and had been waiting for this moment ever since. In the Aztec worldview, death by sacrifice was the highest honor. It guaranteed a place in the paradise of the sun. These men were not victims, they were offerings. But the perspective of the sacrificed is not the only perspective. The people of Tenochtitlan watched from the plaza. Women held children up to see. The noble families stood on the lower platforms of the temple. They were there to witness the renewal of the covenant between the Aztecs and the gods. The sight of blood was not horrifying to them. It was sacred. The priests had told them for generations that the universe required this. The sun fought the darkness every night. It needed human blood to win. The gods had given their own blood to create the world. Now humans gave theirs in return. The logic was clean. The consequences were brutal. On the fourth day, the sacrifices finally slowed. The priests were barely able to stand. Many had not eaten or slept in 72 hours. The obsidian knives had been resharpened so many times that they were dull again. The stone of the altar was cracked from the heat of drying blood. The skull rack, or Tzompantli, had been filled and refilled. The heads of the dead were threaded onto wooden poles in rows. Centuries later, when Spanish conquistadors arrived, they counted over 136,000 skulls in the main rack of Tenochtitlan. But on that fourth day in 1487, the rack was only a fraction of its eventual size. The ceremony was complete. The Emperor Ahuitzotl descended from the platform. He was covered in blood. The chroniclers say that he walked to the edge of the plaza and washed his hands in Lake Texcoco. Then he gave a speech. He told his people that the gods were satisfied. The sun would rise. The rains would come. The empire would prosper. The crowd cheered. The drumming stopped. The city of Tenochtitlan returned to its daily life. But what happened during those 4 days? Who was involved? And how could a civilization that built floating gardens, created a written language, and calculated the movement of the stars also commit mass sacrifice on a scale that staggers the imagination? The Aztec Empire was, at its core, a machine designed to produce stability through violence. It controlled the Valley of Mexico through a tributary system. Conquered cities paid a steady income of goods: maize, beans, cotton, cacao, gold, jade, and human beings. The humans were the most important part. They were used for labor, for sale, and for sacrifice. The Aztecs did not see sacrifice as murder. They saw it as a continuation of the cosmic order. The gods had sacrificed themselves to create the world. Humanity had to return that gift. Without it, the world would end. The question that has haunted historians ever since is whether the scale of Aztec sacrifice was ever as large as the chronicles claim. The Spanish, arriving in 1519, had every reason to exaggerate. They wanted to make the Aztecs look barbaric to justify their own conquest. The Aztec records, written on bark paper and deerskin, were largely destroyed by the Spanish priests. What survives comes from a handful of indigenous chroniclers writing after the conquest, and from the Spanish missionaries who interviewed survivors. These sources are inconsistent. The number 20,000 for the 1487 dedication appears in the work of Diego Duran, a Dominican friar who relied on native informants. But the Annals of Tlatelolco, written by Aztec elders, mention only a few hundred. Modern archaeology has tried to settle the question. Excavations at the Templo Mayor have uncovered hundreds of human skulls, their perforated sides matching the description of the skull racks. But the numbers are in the hundreds, not the thousands. The foundation of the temple contains layers of human remains, but again, the scale is far below the chronicles. What this suggests is that the numbers were symbolic as much as literal. The Aztecs used the concept of 20,000 as a figure meaning an enormous number, not an exact count. The Spanish took it literally. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. The sacrifice was real, the blood was real, but the numbers were inflated by both Aztec and Spanish propaganda. What is not in dispute is that the Aztec system of sacrifice was deeply tied to their concept of kingship. The Emperor Ahuitzotl was not just a political leader. He was a priest king. His legitimacy depended on his ability to provide captives for sacrifice. Every major imperial ceremony required bloodshed. Cornerstone of a new building, coronation of a new ruler, inauguration of a new calendar cycle. All of them demanded human offerings. The more important the ceremony, the more victims were needed. Ahuitzotl's dedication of the Templo Mayor was the largest such event in Aztec history. It was also a warning to his enemies. Look what happens to those who resist us. The system worked for a long time. The Aztec Empire expanded rapidly under Ahuitzotl and his successors. The valley was unified under one rule. Trade routes stretched from the Pacific to the Gulf. The city of Tenochtitlan grew to become one of the largest in the world, with a population of around 200,000, larger than any European city of the time. The engineering that allowed this growth was remarkable. Chinampas, artificial islands built in the lake, produced up to 7 harvests a year. Aqueducts brought fresh water from the mainland. A network of canals moved goods and people. The city was clean, orderly, and beautiful. The Spanish, when they first saw it, called it a dream. But the sacrifice was not a footnote. It was the engine that drove the entire system. Every year, thousands of people were offered to the gods. The Aztecs believed that if the sacrifices stopped, the sun would not rise again. That belief was absolute. It was taught to every child. It was carved into every monument. It was written into the calendar. The priests were the most powerful class in society because they alone could communicate with the gods. The emperor derived his power from the priesthood, and the priesthood derived its power from sacrifice. The cracks in that system did not appear until the arrival of the Spanish in 1509. But even before that, the empire had internal problems. Conquered provinces frequently rebelled. The tributary system was resented. The demand for sacrificial victims meant that every war was a war of annihilation. The Aztecs could not afford to make peace. They needed prisoners. This made them feared but also hated. When the Spanish arrived, they found thousands of allies eager to overthrow the Aztec yoke. The Tlaxcalans, the Aztecs' traditional enemies, provided the bulk of Cortés's army. They joined not because they loved the Spanish, but because they hated the Aztecs more. The last Aztec emperor, Moctezuma II, tried a different approach. He tried diplomacy. He sent gifts. He tried to convince the Spanish that he was a god. It did not work. Cortés understood that the Aztec system of sacrifice was a political weakness. He used it to justify his conquest. He told the Spanish crown that he was saving the people from barbarism. But in truth, the Spanish were simply replacing one system of violence with another. The encomienda system, land grants, forced labor, and disease killed far more people in the decades after the conquest than the Aztec sacrifices ever did. The 1487 dedication of the Templo Mayor remains the most vivid illustration of what the Aztec Empire was willing to do to maintain its power. It was not a random outburst of cruelty. It was a carefully planned, religiously justified, politically calculated event. It served multiple purposes. It honored the gods, it terrified enemies, it unified the city, and it reinforced the emperor's authority. The blood was real, but so was the calculation. And that may be the most disturbing part. The Aztecs were not mindless savages. They were rational actors in a system that demanded irrational violence. When the system collapsed, it took the city with it. Tenochtitlan fell to the Spanish in 1501. The Templo Mayor was torn down, stone by stone, and a Catholic cathedral was built on its foundation. The skull rack was buried. The canals were filled. But the question of why the Aztecs did what they did has never been fully answered. It remains a fracture in our understanding of human civilization. How can a society that built libraries and botanical gardens also build altars dripping with human blood? There is no simple answer. The Aztecs were not unique. Every civilization has its blind spots. The empire of the Aztecs was a mirror. In their devotion to the sun, their belief in the necessity of sacrifice, their willingness to kill for a higher purpose, we see something uncomfortable about ourselves. We just prefer not to look directly at it. The ceremony of 1487 lasted 4 days. By the end, the plaza of Tenochtitlan had become a charnel house. The priests were exhausted. The emperor had fulfilled his duty. The sun continued to rise. The empire continued to function. The Aztecs went on to build an even greater state over the next 3 decades until the Spanish arrived. But the memory of that week never faded. It was recorded in the codices. It was whispered in the villages. It was told to the Spanish when they asked about the old gods. And when the Spanish asked how many had died, no one could give a precise number. They only knew it was enough. Enough to feed the sun. Enough to keep the world turning. Enough to make the Aztecs the most feared empire in the Valley of Mexico. What happened next would shatter that world forever. On the morning of April 22, 1519, a fleet of 11 ships anchored off the coast of what is now Veracruz, Mexico. The vessels carried about 500 Spanish soldiers, 16 horses, and a handful of cannons. Their commander was Hernan Cortés, a man who had been in the New World for over a decade but had never attempted anything like this. He had been sent from Cuba on a mission to explore and trade, but he had something else in mind. Within hours of landing, Cortés began making contact with local indigenous leaders. He had heard stories of a great empire inland, a city built on a lake, and a ruler who commanded gold and tribute. He wanted it. The first encounter was with the Totonac people who lived along the coast. They were subjects of the Aztec Empire and resented the tribute they had to pay. Cortés recognized this immediately. He did not come as an enemy of the local tribes. He came as a liberator. He told the Totonac that he would protect them from the Aztecs. In return, they provided food, porters, and intelligence. Within weeks, Cortés had established a base and a small town called Villa Rica de la Vera Cruz. He also did something that would define the rest of the campaign. He deliberately scuttled his own ships. This was not an accident. He told his men that escape was no longer possible. They would either conquer or die. What happened next was a series of events that no one in the Valley of Mexico saw coming. Cortés marched inland with his Spanish force and a growing army of indigenous allies. He defeated the Tlaxcalans in battle, then turned them into his most important partners. The Tlaxcalans had been fighting the Aztecs for generations and saw the Spanish as a weapon. Cortés also encountered the Sempoala, another tributary state. He learned that the Aztec Empire was not a single unified nation. It was a patchwork of conquered provinces held together by fear and tribute. Many of them wanted out. By November 1519, Cortés and his allies reached the outskirts of Tenochtitlan. The city was everything the stories had promised. The Spanish soldiers who saw it for the first time later wrote that they thought they were in a dream. Canals lined with gardens, causeways wide enough for 10 horsemen, pyramids that shone with white stucco. And in the center, the great Templo Mayor, where only a few decades earlier thousands had been sacrificed. Moctezuma II, the Aztec emperor, came out to greet them. He was dressed in a gold headdress and a cloak of feathers. He offered gifts and housed the Spanish in a palace. But the first signs of trouble came quickly. The Spanish were not guests for long. They took Moctezuma hostage in his own palace. Cortés reasoned that if he controlled the emperor, he controlled the empire. For several months, this worked. Moctezuma continued to give orders, but the Spanish were writing them. The Aztec nobles grew suspicious. The people began to turn against their own leader. In the spring of 1520, while Cortés was away dealing with a rival Spanish expedition sent to arrest him, a massacre occurred in the main temple of Tenochtitlan. One of Cortés's lieutenants, Pedro de Alvarado, ordered an attack on unarmed Aztec nobles who were celebrating a religious festival. Hundreds were killed. When Cortés returned, he found the city in open rebellion. The Aztecs elected a new emperor, Cuitlahuac, who immediately prepared for war. On the night of June 30th, 1520, the Spanish tried to escape the city under cover of darkness. They were discovered, and a chaotic retreat began. The causeways were crowded with soldiers, allies, horses, and treasure. The Aztecs attacked from canoes and from the rooftops. Hundreds of Spanish soldiers were killed or captured. Most of the prisoners were taken to the top of the Templo Mayor and sacrificed in plain view of the survivors. Cortés himself barely made it out. He lost his entire artillery, his gold, and most of his men. This night became known as the Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. What happened after that was not a defeat but a regrouping. Cortés retreated to Tlaxcala, where his allies gave him shelter. He rebuilt his army, received reinforcements from Cuba, and began planning a siege. The Aztecs, meanwhile, suffered a blow they could not have predicted. Smallpox, introduced by the Spanish, swept through the Valley of Mexico. The indigenous population had no immunity. The disease killed Cuitlahuac and thousands of others. The new emperor, Cuauhtémoc, took command of a city already in crisis. The siege of Tenochtitlan began in May 1521 and lasted 75 days. Cortés cut off the causeways, destroyed the aqueduct that brought fresh water, and blockaded the lake with brigantines built by his Tlaxcalan allies. The Aztecs fought from house to house, from canoe to canoe. They had no metal weapons, no horses, no cannons, but they had numbers and determination. The fighting was brutal. The Spanish and their allies killed indiscriminately. Women, children, the elderly. None were spared. By the end of August, the city was a ruin. The canals were clogged with corpses. The temples were torn down. Cuauhtémoc was captured while trying to escape in a canoe. He was later tortured, then hanged. The fall of Tenochtitlan was complete. The Aztec Empire ceased to exist. The Spanish built Mexico City on top of the ruins. They drained the lake, filled the canals, and erected churches and government buildings. The Templo Mayor was dismantled block by block. Its stones were used for the foundations of the Cathedral of Mexico City. The skull rack was buried. The codices were burned. The gods were replaced. The population of central Mexico, estimated at around 15 million before the conquest, fell to fewer than 2 million within a century. Disease, forced labor, and violence did the work. But the sacrifice did not end. It merely took a new form. The Spanish required labor, tribute, and conversion. The indigenous people were made to work in mines and on plantations. Their children were taken to mission schools. Their temples were replaced with crosses. The Aztec priests were killed or converted. The old gods were driven underground, where they survived in secret for centuries. Today, some indigenous communities still practice rituals that have their roots in the pre-Columbian past, but they are hidden beneath a layer of Catholic symbolism. The question of why the Aztecs practiced human sacrifice on such a scale is often answered with cultural relativism, but that answer feels hollow. The truth is that the Aztec belief system was a logical conclusion of a worldview that required cosmic balance. The sun needed blood to move across the sky. The earth needed blood to produce crops. The gods had given their own blood to create the world, and humans had to repay that debt. The Aztecs were not uniquely cruel. They were uniquely consistent. They followed their theology to its final conclusion. What modern archaeology has revealed is that the scale of sacrifice, while still massive, was not as uniformly high as the chronicles claimed. The temple offerings found at the Templo Mayor include remains of children, adults, and animals, but the total number of human skulls recovered is in the hundreds, not the tens of thousands. The famous skull rack, the Tzompantli, was real, but its size may have been exaggerated. Some scholars now believe that the 20,000 sacrificed at the 1,487 dedication was a symbolic number, perhaps representing a combination of real deaths and ritual counts. The Aztecs themselves may have used the figure to convey the idea of an overwhelming number, not a literal census. What is not in dispute is that sacrifice was central to Aztec identity. The warrior class existed for the purpose of taking captives. The flower wars, negotiated battles fought against Tlaxcala and other states were designed to produce sacrificial victims without annihilating the enemy completely. The calendar was divided into cycles of ritual sacrifice that required different types of offerings for different gods. The priesthood was trained from childhood to perform the rites. The emperor himself, on certain occasions, would perform the sacrifice with his own hands. This system worked for about a century. It held the empire together through fear and piety, but it also created enemies. The Aztecs could not make peace with their neighbors because they needed their captives. Every conquered province was a source of both tribute and victims. That cycle of violence made it possible for Cortés to find thousands of allies willing to fight against the Aztecs. The Tlaxcalans, the Huixotzincans, the Totonacs, and others all joined the Spanish because they saw a chance to break the Aztec grip. They fought not because they understood Spanish motives, but because they understood their own suffering. The irony is that the Spanish conquest did not end sacrifice. It just transformed it. The Spanish burned heretics, executed rebels, and subjected indigenous people to forced labor that killed millions. The encomienda system, which gave Spanish colonists the right to the labor of native people, was a form of legalized slavery. Disease did the rest. The Aztec world was destroyed, but the violence that destroyed it was no less brutal. It was simply different. Today, the memory of the Aztec Empire is preserved in the stones of Mexico City. The Templo Mayor was rediscovered in 1978 during electrical excavations. Workers uncovered a stone carving of the moon goddess Coyolxauhqui, dismembered in stone exactly as the myth described. That discovery led to a full archaeological excavation that revealed the layers of the temple, each one built over the previous. The site is now a museum. Tourists walk through the ruins of a civilization that once demanded the hearts of thousands. But the deeper question remains. How could a society so advanced in art, astronomy, engineering, and governance justify such systematic violence? The answer is not simple. It involves religion, politics, ecology, and psychology. The Aztecs believed they were fighting for the survival of the cosmos. That belief gave them the strength to build an empire and the justification to destroy it. And when the Spanish came with their own beliefs, the clash was not between good and evil. It was between two systems that both used violence as a tool of control. One used sacrifice to feed the sun. The other used forced conversion to save souls. Both left the Valley of Mexico soaked in blood. The fall of Tenochtitlan in 1521 marked the end of an era. But the Aztec legacy is not just a story of defeat. It is a story of how a people made sense of a world that was often terrifying. They built a city on a lake. They created a calendar that tracked the stars. They wrote poetry about the fragility of life. And they cut the hearts out of thousands of human beings. All of these things are true. The challenge is holding them together in the same thought. In February 1978, electrical workers digging in downtown Mexico City struck something hard. They were installing new cables near the main plaza, the Zocalo. What they found was not a pipe or a foundation stone. It was a massive stone disc, 11 feet in diameter, carved with the image of a dismembered female figure. The workers stopped. Archaeologists were called. Within hours, the site became one of the most important excavations in Mexican history. The disc was identified as Coyolxauhqui, the moon goddess, torn apart in stone exactly as the Aztec myth described. And beneath it lay the remains of the Templo Mayor, the central pyramid of Tenochtitlan, buried for nearly 5 centuries. What happened next was a race against time. Mexico City had been built directly on top of the Aztec capital. The colonial cathedral sat only a few meters away. Modern buildings surrounded the site. Excavators worked carefully, layer by layer. They found not one pyramid but 7. Each Aztec emperor had built a new layer over the previous one, enlarging the temple with each reign. The deepest layers dated back to the founding of the city in 1325. The uppermost layer, built by Moctezuma II, was the one the Spanish had seen and then demolished. The excavation revealed staircases, altars, offering caches, and the remains of countless sacrifices. Children, adults, animals, all buried as gifts to the gods. The Templo Mayor was not just a temple, it was the center of the Aztec universe. Two shrines sat at its top, one dedicated to Tlaloc, the rain god, and one to Huitzilopochtli, the god of war and the sun. The two gods represented the dual forces that sustained the empire: water and war, agriculture and conquest. The pyramid itself was a physical symbol of the cosmic mountain, the place where the earth split open and the gods emerged. Every step of the temple was a step toward the divine, and every sacrifice performed at its summit was a repayment of the debt owed to the gods for creating the world. How did the Aztecs understand this debt? Their creation myth began with the gods sacrificing themselves. According to the legend, the gods gathered at Teotihuacan to create the sun. Two gods jumped into a fire, becoming the sun and the moon. But the sun did not move. It needed blood to travel across the sky. The gods gave their own blood. Then they asked humans to continue the offering. This was not a punishment. It was a duty. The Aztecs believed that without human blood, the sun would stop, the world would end, and the universe would return to darkness. Sacrifice was not an act of cruelty. It was an act of survival. This belief shaped every aspect of Aztec life. The calendar was divided into 18 months of 20 days each, plus 5 unlucky days. Each month had its own festival, its own god, and its own specific type of sacrifice. Some victims were decapitated, some were burned, some were shot with arrows, some were drowned, some were flayed and their skins worn by priests. The method depended on the god being honored. The scale varied, but the purpose was always the same: to feed the cosmos. Who were the victims? Many were prisoners of war. The Flower Wars, fought against neighboring states like Tlaxcala, were explicitly designed to capture soldiers for sacrifice. But not all victims were enemy warriors. Slaves were sometimes purchased for the purpose. Children were offered to Tlaloc during times of drought. Their tears, it was said, would bring rain. Women were sacrificed to earth goddesses, and on rare occasions, nobles or even priests offered themselves voluntarily. To die on the sacrificial stone was considered an honor. It guaranteed a place in the highest heaven, the home of the sun. The process of sacrifice was highly ritualized. The victim was led up the steps of the pyramid, often drugged with pulque or datura to numb the pain. 4 priests held the victim down on the stone. A 5th priest, the one who performed the cutting, used an obsidian knife. The blade was sharp enough to split a hair. He made a single cut below the ribs, then reached into the chest and pulled out the still-beating heart. The heart was placed in a bowl or held up to the sun. The body was then pushed down the steps. The head was severed and placed on the skull rack. The rest of the body was sometimes eaten, distributed among the priests and warriors as a form of ritual cannibalism. This was not about nutrition. It was about absorbing the power of the victim. The Spanish chroniclers were horrified by what they saw. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, a soldier in Cortés's army, wrote of the skull rack at Tenochtitlan. He claimed it held over 100,000 skulls. Modern archaeologists have found the remains of the Tzompantli. The actual number was likely in the thousands, not the hundreds of thousands. But the chroniclers were not lying. They were exaggerating, perhaps, but they were also reporting what they believed they saw. The scale of sacrifice was unlike anything in Europe. It was a system so alien that it could only be described in numbers that seemed impossible. What the Spanish did not understand was that sacrifice was not only about death, it was about maintaining the social order. The Aztec state was a theocracy. The emperor was considered a representative of the gods. The priests held immense power. The warriors gained status through capturing enemies. Sacrifice was the glue that held this system together. It provided a common purpose, a shared belief that the empire was not just a political entity but a cosmic necessity. Every conquered province paid tribute in gold, food, cloth, and victims. The tribute system fed the capital and fed the gods. But the system had a fatal weakness. It created enemies. Every province that paid tribute resented the demand for sacrificial victims. When Cortés arrived, he found thousands of willing allies. The Tlaxcalans, the Totonacs, the Huixotzincans, and others had been fighting the Aztecs for generations. They joined the Spanish not because they loved the Spanish, but because they hated the Aztecs more. Cortés understood this. He exploited it. He turned the Flower Wars into a civil war. The siege of Tenochtitlan in 1521 was not a battle between Spain and Mexico. It was a battle between an alliance of indigenous peoples and the Aztec Empire. The Spanish provided horses, steel, gunpowder, and disease. The indigenous allies provided the vast majority of the troops. Estimates suggest that Cortés commanded around 900 Spaniards and perhaps 100,000 indigenous warriors. The Aztecs, weakened by smallpox, could muster tens of thousands at most. The numbers were not equal. The siege itself was a masterpiece of military engineering. Cortés built 13 brigantines, small sailing ships on the shores of Lake Texcoco. He had them carried over the mountains in pieces and assembled. These ships cut off the Aztec supply lines by water. On land, his forces blocked the causeways. The aqueduct that brought fresh water from Chapultepec was destroyed. The Aztecs were forced to drink brackish lake water, which spread disease further. The fighting was house to house, street to street. The Aztecs fought with obsidian-edged swords, spears, and slings. They had no horses, no cannons, no metal armor. But they had the advantage of familiar terrain and a desperate will to survive. The turning point came in late June 1521 during the final assault. The Spanish and their allies pushed into the city center. They captured the Templo Mayor. They set fire to the shrines. The Aztecs, led by Cuauhtémoc, retreated to the eastern part of the city. The fighting became a massacre. Women and children were killed indiscriminately. The canals ran red. The Spanish chroniclers described the scene as hell on earth. When the city finally fell on August 13, 1521, the population had been reduced from perhaps 300,000 to fewer than 30,000. The rest were dead, enslaved, or fled. Cuauhtémoc was captured while trying to escape across the lake. He was brought before Cortés, who demanded to know where the Aztec gold was hidden. Cuauhtémoc replied, "I am not on a bed of roses." He was tortured by having his feet burned with oil. He did not reveal the gold, probably because most of it had already been looted or sunk in the lake. He was kept prisoner for 4 years, then hanged during Cortés's expedition to Honduras. The aftermath of the conquest was not a return to peace. It was the beginning of a new kind of violence. The Spanish imposed the encomienda system, which granted colonists the right to the labor of indigenous people. In practice, this was slavery. Indigenous people were forced to work in mines, on plantations, and in construction. They were beaten, overworked, and underfed. Disease continued to ravage the population. Smallpox, measles, typhus, and influenza killed millions. By 1600, the indigenous population of central Mexico had fallen from an estimated 15 million to fewer than 2 million. The Spanish also imposed a new religion. The old gods were demonized, temples were destroyed, codices were burned, priests were killed or converted. The Aztec calendar was replaced with the Christian calendar. The human sacrifice was abolished by force. But the Spanish had their own forms of sacrifice. They burned heretics at the stake. They executed rebels. They forced conversion at sword point. And they justified it all with the same certainty that the Aztecs had used to justify their own rituals. One system fed the sun with blood. The other fed God with souls. Both were absolute. What remains today is a landscape of memory. The Templo Mayor sits open to the sky, a scar in the heart of Mexico City. The cathedral built on top of it still stands. The stones of the Aztec pyramid are visible in the foundations of colonial buildings. The skull rack has been excavated and is now displayed in the museum. The Coyolxauhqui stone sits at the base of the pyramid, exactly where it was placed 500 years ago. Visitors walk through the ruins and try to imagine the city that once surrounded them. But the deeper truth is that the Aztec Empire is not fully gone. Its language, Nahuatl, is still spoken by nearly 2 million people. Its food, from tortillas to chocolate, is still eaten. Its agricultural techniques, like the chinampas, are still used in some areas. Its calendar is still studied. Its poetry is still read. The Aztec worldview, with its emphasis on balance, debt, and the fragility of existence, still resonates. And the question that the Aztecs asked themselves still remains: what must we give to keep the world alive? In the end, the Aztec Empire was a civilization of contradictions. It built the most advanced city in the Americas and sacrificed thousands to keep the sun moving. It created a calendar more accurate than the European one, and believed that the universe was held together by blood. It wrote beautiful poetry about the fleeting nature of life, and then cut the hearts out of living human beings. All of this is true, and all of it must be held together in the same thought. That is the burden of history. To understand the Aztecs is not to excuse them. It is to recognize that every civilization, including our own, has its own blind spots, its own justifications, its own forms of sacrifice. The difference is only in the shape of the knife. In the year 1790, workers in Mexico City were repairing the central plaza, the Zocalo, when they struck something solid beneath the ground. It was a massive stone disc, nearly 12 feet in diameter, carved with intricate concentric rings of glyphs and symbols. They had unearthed the sun stone, one of the most famous artifacts of the Aztec world. For nearly 3 centuries, it had lain buried under the colonial capital, forgotten. The stone was lifted and moved to the edge of the cathedral, where it remained exposed to the elements for decades. Scholars were baffled by its complexity. They assumed it was a calendar, a precise instrument to track the solar year. They were partly right, but the sun stone was not only a calendar. It was a statement of cosmic power, a visual map of the Aztec understanding of time, creation, and destruction. The stone was carved in the late 15th century, probably under the rule of Axyacatl or Tizoc. It weighs over 24 tons. At its center is the face of Tanadia, the sun god with a tongue shaped like a sacrificial knife. Surrounding him are 4 squares, each representing a previous sun, a previous world that had been destroyed. The first world ended when jaguars devoured the people. The second world ended in wind. The third world ended in fire rain. The fourth world ended in flood. The fifth world, the current one, was the world of motion, and it too would end in earthquake. The Aztecs believed they were living in the fifth sun, a fragile age that required constant nourishment, human blood, to keep the sun moving across the sky. The entire stone is a reminder of that debt. The discovery of the sunstone sparked a wave of interest in Aztec history, but for centuries, the stone was misinterpreted. Early scholars thought it was a sacrificial altar or a giant clock. It was not used for sacrifices. It was a ceremonial monument, a public declaration of the Aztec cosmos. The real calendars were separate: the tonal Pohuali, the 260-day sacred calendar, and the Ziu Pohuali, the 365-day solar calendar. The sun stone combined elements of both, but its purpose was more ideological than practical. It was a warning and a promise. The world had been created and destroyed 4 times. The fifth world could only survive if the gods were repaid. Today, the sun stone sits in the National Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City, inside a climate-controlled room, surrounded by tourists and scholars. It is one of the most visited objects in the country, but its meaning is still debated. Some scholars argue that the stone was never intended as a calendar at all, but as a glorification of the Aztec emperor, who was the earthly representative of the sun. The emperor's face may be carved into the central disc. The stone, then, was propaganda, a statement that the emperor's power was as eternal and necessary as the sun itself. What the sun stone reveals is that the Aztec understanding of time was cyclical, not linear. The world did not move forward toward a single end. It moved in circles, repeating patterns of creation and destruction. Human sacrifice was the engine that kept the cycles turning. Without it, the sun would stop, the stars would fall, and the earth would be consumed by darkness. This belief was not a metaphor. It was a literal, urgent reality. The Aztec state organized its entire economy, military, and religion around this premise. But how did this belief system emerge? To answer that, we need to go back further to the origins of Mesoamerican civilization itself. The practice of human sacrifice in central Mexico predates the Aztecs by thousands of years. The Olmecs, the Maya, the Teotihuacanos all performed sacrifices. The Aztecs inherited these traditions and intensified them. They were not the inventors of sacrifice. They were its final, most extreme practitioners. The roots lie in the geography of the Valley of Mexico. The lake system was unstable. The volcanic soil was fertile but unpredictable. The climate could swing from drought to flood. The Aztecs saw the world as a place of constant struggle, where gods and humans fought for survival. The myth of the five sons is a story of failed attempts, of gods sacrificing themselves only to be defeated. The Aztecs believed that the gods had set the universe in motion by throwing themselves into a fire, becoming the sun and the moon. That act of self-sacrifice established a pattern. Humans had to imitate the gods. They had to give blood to keep the cosmic balance. The Spanish conquest did not erase this worldview overnight. It forced it underground. Indigenous communities continued to practice elements of their religion in secret, blending them with Catholicism. The Virgin of Guadalupe, for example, appeared on a hill that had once been a shrine to the mother goddess Tonantzin. The Aztec goddess of water, Chalchutlicue, was absorbed into the figure of the Virgin. The ancient temples were torn down, but the stones were reused in churches. The old gods were not destroyed. They were renamed. In the centuries after the conquest, the memory of the Aztec Empire became a symbol of resistance. Indigenous leaders invoked the name of Cuauhtémoc as a martyr. The 18th century Mexican independence movement used Aztec imagery to reject Spanish rule. The first Mexican flag after independence featured an eagle eating a snake, directly lifted from the Aztec foundation myth. The Republic of Mexico claimed the Aztec past as its own, even as it continued to marginalize the living descendants of that empire. Archaeology in the 20th century unearthed more of the Aztec world. In 1978, workers digging for an electrical cable near the Zocalo discovered a large stone disc. It was the Coyolxauhqui stone, depicting the dismembered moon goddess. This discovery led to the excavation of the Templo Mayor, which had been buried under colonial buildings for centuries. The excavation is ongoing. Each layer reveals more about the rituals, the offerings, the victims. Archaeologists have found the remains of children, warriors, and women, some with their hearts cut out, others decapitated, others thrown into the water as offerings to Tlaloc. The soil is rich with obsidian blades, jade beads, and the bones of jaguars and eagles. One of the most startling discoveries was the skull rack, the Tzompantli. It was not a single row of skulls, but a wall of skulls, stacked on wooden beams. The skulls were often perforated and threaded like beads. The Tzompantli at Tenochtitlan was massive, but similar structures were found in other Aztec cities. The skulls were not just trophies. They were offerings, public displays of the power of the state and the gods. They were also a warning: resist, and your head will join the pile. Modern researchers have analyzed the skulls using forensic techniques. They found that many victims were not warriors captured in battle, but slaves, criminals, and even children bought specifically for sacrifice. Some skulls showed signs of healing, indicating that the victims had been kept alive for months, perhaps years, before their death. The ritual was not a quick execution. It was a process. The victim was often treated as a divine representative before the sacrifice, given honors, fed well, allowed to walk through the city. Then, at the top of the pyramid, the priest made the incision. The heart was removed and held up to the sun. The body was then pushed down the steps, where it was collected by the lower priests. The limbs were often butchered and consumed in ritual cannibalism. The head was cleaned and displayed on the Tzompantli. The torso was buried or thrown into the lake. Nothing was wasted. Every part of the body had a function. Why would a society develop such a system? The easy answer is religion. But religion alone does not explain the scale. The Aztec Empire was a tribute empire, demanding payments in goods and people from conquered provinces. Sacrificial victims were a form of currency, a way to display wealth and power. The more victims a ruler sacrificed, the more prestigious he became. The more prestige, the more allies. The more allies, the more tribute. It was a cycle that fed on itself. But the system also had a dark pragmatism. The Aztecs believed that the gods needed blood to sustain the universe. If the gods were not fed, the world would end. That belief was not unique to the Aztecs. Many ancient cultures practiced sacrifice. What was unique was the scale and the institutionalization. Sacrifice was not a marginal practice. It was the central activity of the state. The Templo Mayor was the heart of the empire, and it pumped blood. The Spanish were horrified, but they were also strategic. They used the horror of sacrifice to justify their conquest. They portrayed the Aztecs as barbarians who deserved to be destroyed. That narrative persisted for centuries. It shaped the way the Aztec Empire was taught in schools, written about in history books, and depicted in popular culture. The Aztecs became a symbol of savagery, a cautionary tale about the dangers of pagan religion. But modern scholarship has complicated that picture. The Aztecs were not simply bloodthirsty. They were a complex society with art, philosophy, poetry, law, and medicine. They built a city on a lake that rivaled any in Europe. They developed a writing system based on pictographs and glyphs. They created a legal code with courts and judges. They had schools for commoners and elites. They had a tax system, a postal service, and a market economy. The same hands that carved the sun stone also held the sacrificial knife. The tragedy of the Aztec Empire is not that it fell. All empires fall. The tragedy is that its story has been told almost exclusively by its enemies. The Spanish chroniclers wrote the first histories, and they had every reason to exaggerate and demonize. The Aztec version of events was largely destroyed. A few codices survived, but they are difficult to interpret. The voices of the victims, the ones who were sacrificed, are silent. We have only the bones. In the 21st century, archaeology continues to fill the gaps. The Templo Mayor project has uncovered thousands of offerings: seashells, coral, animal bones, human remains, and objects from as far away as the Pacific and the Gulf of Mexico. These offerings tell a story of trade, conquest, and belief. They show that the Aztec world was connected to a larger Mesoamerican network. They also show that the Aztecs were constantly innovating, adapting older traditions to their own needs. One of the most recent discoveries in 2019 was a large platform filled with human skulls, over 600, in a part of the Templo Mayor complex. These skulls were arranged in rows, facing outward, as if watching. They belonged to men, women, and children. Some were from the city itself, not from foreign wars. This challenges the old idea that only captured warriors were sacrificed. The Aztecs also sacrificed their own people, perhaps as part of ritual debt payments or to appease specific gods. The discovery raises new questions. Who were these people? Why were they chosen? Were they volunteers, as some chroniclers claimed? There is evidence that some victims went willingly, believing they would become gods in the afterlife. But there is also evidence of resistance. Some skulls showed signs of struggle, of bones broken while the person was still alive. The truth is probably a mix. Some went willingly, some were forced, and most probably had no choice. The legacy of the Aztec Empire is still alive in Mexico today. The national identity is built on a fusion of indigenous and Spanish elements, but the indigenous side is often romanticized or simplified. The Aztecs are celebrated as ancestors, but their human sacrifice is downplayed. The Spanish conquest is condemned, but the colonial period is also the foundation of modern Mexico. These contradictions are not easy to resolve. What remains certain is that the Aztec Empire was a civilization of extremes. It built soaring pyramids and bathed them in blood. It wrote elegant poetry about the transience of life, and then ended thousands of lives in the name of that same transience. It believed that the universe was a fragile thing, held together by sacrifice. In that belief, it was not entirely wrong. Every civilization, including ours, sacrifices something to maintain its existence: resources, freedoms, lives. The difference is only in what is given and what is taken. And so the question the Aztecs asked themselves still echoes across the centuries. What must we give to keep the world alive? For them, the answer was blood. For us, the answer is perhaps something else. But the question itself endures. It is the question that every human society must answer. And history, if we listen carefully, might offer a warning. On the 20th of August, 2015, a team of archaeologists from the National Institute of Anthropology and History of Mexico was working in the historic center of Mexico City. They were excavating a site just north of the Metropolitan Cathedral, a few hundred feet from the ruins of the Templo Mayor. What they found that day was not unexpected, but it still stopped the work. The trowel of one excavator struck something hard, smooth, and round. It was a human skull, then another, then a row of them. Within hours, the team realized they had uncovered the edge of a large circular platform. It was the Huitzilopochtli, the great skull rack of Tenochtitlan, mentioned in Spanish chronicles but never before found intact. The excavation was careful. Each skull was photographed, measured, and lifted with extreme care. The soil around them was sifted for beads, fragments of obsidian, and any trace of the wooden beams that once held them. By November of that same year, the team had recovered 180 skulls. By 2017, that number had risen to over 600. They were arranged in concentric circles, all facing outward, their empty eye sockets staring into the open air of what was once the ceremonial precinct. The platform was not a single layer. Skulls were stacked in rows, one above the other, held together with lime mortar. It was a structure built from human remains. What happened? The discovery of the Huitzilopochtli confirmed what the Spanish chroniclers had described, but also changed the understanding of how the Aztecs used human sacrifice. The chroniclers, such as Bernardino de Sahagun and Andrés de Tapia, wrote that the Tezonpantli held the heads of sacrificed warriors and that the number of skulls was in the tens of thousands. For centuries, historians dismissed those numbers as exaggeration, propaganda designed to horrify European readers. But the excavation showed that the skull rack was not a small display. It was a massive, engineered monument. The platform measured roughly 60 meters in diameter. The number of skulls originally embedded in it could have been far higher than 600, perhaps thousands, but much of the structure was destroyed by the Spanish after the conquest and later built over by colonial foundations. Forensic anthropologists examined the skulls. They found that the victims were not all warriors. Many were women, many were children, some were infants. The skulls showed signs of preparation. The temporal bones had been perforated so that the skulls could be threaded onto poles. Some had been cut with obsidian blades in a specific pattern, indicating that the flesh had been removed before the skull was placed on the rack. Others showed signs of healing, meaning the victims had survived injuries before their death. One skull retained the imprint of a headdress made of feathers, suggesting the victim had been dressed as a deity before the sacrifice. The researchers also tested the stable isotopes in the teeth. These chemical signatures reveal where a person grew up. The results were surprising. Many of the victims were not from enemy states like Tlaxcala or Texcoco. They were from the Valley of Mexico itself, likely residents of Tenochtitlan or the surrounding towns. This overturned the long-held assumption that only foreign captives were sacrificed. The Aztecs also sacrificed their own people, perhaps as part of annual rituals or to honor specific gods. The victims were not random. They were often chosen for their physical perfection, their youth, or their symbolic value. A child with a double cowlick might be chosen as an offering to Tlaloc, the rain god, because the cowlick was seen as a sign of divine favor. How could a civilization so advanced in astronomy, engineering, and governance practice such systematic killing? The question is uncomfortable but necessary. The answer lies in the Aztec worldview. The universe, in their belief, had been created and destroyed 4 times before. The current era, the fifth sun, was fragile. It required constant nourishment in the form of human blood. The gods themselves had sacrificed their own blood to create the world, and humanity was obligated to repay that debt. Sacrifice was not murder in the Aztec mind. It was a sacred duty, a reciprocal exchange between gods and humans. The victim was not a criminal but an offering, a gift that sustained all life. This belief was reinforced by the state. The emperor, the Tlatoani, was the high priest of the empire. He personally participated in the most important sacrifices. The temples were the centers of political power. The priesthood was a separate class with its own hierarchy, lands, and privileges. The entire economy of Tenochtitlan was tied to the temple. Tribute from conquered provinces included not only gold, jade, cacao, and cotton, but also human beings destined for sacrifice. The empire could not function without the ritual. And yet, the system also contained the seeds of its own destruction. When the Spanish arrived, they exploited the resentment of the conquered peoples. The Tlaxcalans, the Totonacs, and others had been forced to send their own children and warriors to the sacrificial stone for decades. When Cortés offered them a chance to overthrow the Aztec yoke, they joined him, not because they loved the Spanish, but because they hated the Aztecs more. The alliance of indigenous enemies was the decisive factor in the fall of Tenochtitlan, not Spanish guns or horses. The siege of Tenochtitlan began in May of 151. Cortés cut off the causeways, the aqueduct, and the food supply. The siege lasted 75 days. Inside the city, the Aztecs held out under brutal conditions. Starvation and disease killed more than Spanish swords. Yet the Tzompantli continued to receive new skulls. Even as the city collapsed, the priests kept sacrificing. The Spanish chroniclers recorded that on the final days of the siege, the Aztecs sacrificed several Spanish prisoners and threw their heads into the lake. The system held until the very end. When the city fell on the 13th of August, 1521, the Spanish tore down the temples. They smashed the idols. They buried the Tzompantli under rubble. They built the cathedral directly on top of the Templo Mayor. For nearly 500 years, the skulls lay hidden. The discovery of the Huey Tzompantli in 2015 was not just an archaeological find. It was a reckoning. The bones forced modern Mexico to confront a past that could not be romanticized or ignored. The excavation continues. In 2020, a new section of the Tzompantli was uncovered, containing skulls of women and children with signs of decapitation. In 2022, a cache of severed hands was found nearby, buried as an offering. Each discovery adds a layer of complexity. The Aztecs were not monsters. They were not saints. They were humans who built a civilization on a set of beliefs that demanded sacrifice. Those beliefs were logical within their framework, but the framework itself was brutal. And so the warning that history offers is not that the Aztecs were uniquely violent. It is that any society, when driven by a belief that the end justifies any means, can become a machine that consumes its own people. The Aztecs believed they were saving the world. The Spanish believed they were saving souls. Both groups were willing to kill on a massive scale for their visions of order. The difference is one of technology and time, not of morality. What remains is the question posed by the Aztecs themselves. What must we give to keep the world alive? The modern world gives carbon, forests, clean water, and the lives of the poor. The Aztecs gave blood, which sacrifice is more sustainable. History does not answer that question. It only shows the consequences. And the consequences are always buried in the earth, waiting to be unearthed.